everyone. I would like to welcome you to our November webinar. I'm Jack Stinsky, Program Manager for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. The Lake States Fire Science Consortium is funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, and it's one of 15 regional exchanges across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, adoption, and sharing of wildland fire science information by federal, state, tribal, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. Before we get started, let's just take a few moments to take a look at our interface using Adobe Connect. If you'd like to ask a question or interact with other attendees, you can use the chat box on the lower right-hand screen. Once you type a question, make sure you click Send. We'll be monitoring the chat box and make sure that we have the opportunity to address any of your questions. If you'd like to learn more about us and what we are doing, please visit our website. You can also sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. All right, on to today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Anthony D'Amato. Anthony is an Associate Professor of Silviculture and Applied Forest Ecology in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. His research focuses on long-term forest dynamics, disturbance effects on ecosystem structure and function, and silvicultural strategies for conferring adaptation potential within the context of global change. Anthony received his Bachelor of Science in Forest Ecosystem Science from the University of Maine, his Master's from the University of Massachusetts, and has been faculty member at the University of Minnesota since 2007. Tony, I'm going to turn over the webinar to you now.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks everybody for logging in this afternoon. I recognize several names on the chat log, and it's always tough doing this virtually. It'd be nice to see many of your faces in person, but hopefully you'll have an experience for everyone here. Before I get going too far into the webinar, I just want to acknowledge that what I'll be presenting today really is a culmination of a lot of work that's been ongoing via many investigators here in Minnesota and some folks who have moved to other places, but much of the work I'll talk about today has really been in collaboration, leadership as well of Brian Palick with the Forest Service, John Fravor, who while in Minnesota did quite a bit of work with the Forest Service, is now at the University of Maine. A lot of what I'll talk about today was part of Emily Silver, Master's Research at the University of Minnesota, who's also now at Maine, and John Bradford, who was a Forest Service scientist in Grand Rapids, who's now Flagstaff, Arizona, working for USGS. And basically, what I'll be doing today is talking a bit about some of the large-scale data sets as well as long-term studies we have that allow us to look at how many of the pine forests that cover the areas of north-central Minnesota as well as certainly other parts of the Lake States have developed really over a couple of centuries following post-fire, typically large-scale fire regimes. And I was talking with Jack, but many will be disappointed. I don't think there is a picture of a flame in any of my slides, so I am sorry. But we will certainly be discussing kind of the long-term implications of how these forests develop, particularly in the absence of prescribed fire, as well as certainly in response to other disturbance agents like root disease and wind. And so most folks in the call on the webinar are well aware of kind of the shifts that have occurred in kind of the vast pineries that covered much of both north-central Minnesota as well as other parts of the Lake States. Just to draw folks' attention to it, they don't think as much about Minnesota. This map is one I know many people on the webinar have seen several times over, really showing the pre-settlement forests of the Great Lake States region. And this dark green area here, as well as found in northwestern Wisconsin and certainly Michigan, really represents both jack pine barrens as well as mixed red pine, white pine forests. And so particularly in north-central Minnesota, in the area that now is largely occupied by the Chippewa National Forest as well as Itasca State Park, this is really the epicenter for many vast areas of both red pine and white pine forests as well as jack pine barrens that quickly, following European settlement and large land clearing, has reverted to, as this yellow color indicates, more of an aspen-dominated system. And so at the time of the development of the logging industry in the area, as well as certainly early forest ecology research within north-central Minnesota and other places, there were extensive areas of this mature red pine, jack pine, as well as white pine forest that was the result of large-scale fire, as well as a patchy mixed severity fire regime. Even though we've seen a decline in the red pine forest type on the landscape, we certainly still can get red pine established. This picture on the right is our general approach to red pine management, particularly in Minnesota, where largely it's even-aged plantations following clear-cut harvesting really have a lot of difficulty with natural regeneration of red pine, primarily in Minnesota due to both diplodia as well as certainly deer browse issues and heavy shrub competition. And so even though this mature red pine forest type that was quite complex structurally and compositionally was a large portion of the land base, currently much of our red pine on managed areas is in either young age or middle-aged age class, a lot of it resulting from plantations put in at the time of the Boundary Waters wilderness area being established in the 70s. And so we are often left with struggling to find ways to increase the representation of this mature red pine habitat in the landscape, as well as trying to find ways to naturally regenerate red pine and maintain that cover type over large areas at low cost. So the main objectives of what I'm going to talk about today are to really use some long-term data sets that are quite unique, really globally unique, but certainly special for our understanding of red pine forests in Minnesota, to try to get a better sense of, what are the long-term patterns of development that we've seen really over the past couple of centuries in relation to these forests that really sprung up following both large-scale natural fires several centuries ago, as well as ones that originated following fires in the late 1800s, understanding how both active management as well as lack of management might influence the way at which these forests progress over time. And then specifically address the issue related to the need and desire for more mature pine habitat in the landscape, yet many of our forests are still relatively young, and so trying to evaluate, can we use extended rotation systems or thinning or other techniques to accelerate late successional pine conditions within stands, and so use data sets to address that. So to get at these questions, I'm going to take advantage of four studies within north central Minnesota, again largely centered on the Chippewa National Forest and the Itasca State Park area, and basically use these long-term studies as different pieces of information to give us insight on both how forests developed over time in the absence of management, as well as to get an idea as to how management may have influenced or maybe encouraged the development of structural and compositional conditions that might be desirable in our contemporary forests. So I'm going to go into more detail about each of these studies in a moment, but just as a snapshot, basically the first project I'm going to talk a lot about is what's known as the Allison plot. It's an unmanaged old-growth stand within Itasca State Park that has a very detailed management history extending back into the 1920s. The growing stock levels experiment, which is a long-term silviculture study on the Cutfoot Sioux experimental forest, where basically they've been managing that forest outwards into the age of 150. Red pine management giving us a chance to look at how forests that are managed on extended rotations might compare to unmanaged old forests. The third study is a series of studies that were put in by John Bradford when he was in Minnesota, basically looking at different ages of red pine that hadn't been managed, chronosequence, allowing us to provide a comparison to kind of second growth forests that have been managed relative to those that haven't been managed, and do we see any differences in their development over time. And then finally, some work that many of you are likely familiar with that Sean Fravor and Brian Palick were involved with, where they looked at a series of old growth sites across northern Minnesota, giving us a sense for what the range of structures and disturbance processes might be in old growth stand. And so I'll try my best throughout the rest of the webinar to keep reminding you what data sets we're using to ask these questions, but collectively these four studies really serve as a powerful lens in the past in terms of how these forests developed and what they might infer for the future in terms of how they might grow. So starting just with an overview of where these sites are, basically, as I mentioned, we're really focusing primarily in north central Minnesota. You see the outline of the Chippewa National Forest here. This is Itasca State Park, and then Superior National Forest and Boundary Waters. And so the majority of the second growth stands that we'll be talking about really are from within the Chippewa National Forest on the Cutfoot Experimental Forest. This yellow dot represents the location of that long-term growing stock level study, and these open squares just indicate its overlap with some of those unmanaged second growth stands. These asterisks correspond to old growth sites, 7 of which are from Sean Fravor's work, and then this northern site within Itasca State Park is what I'll collectively refer to as the Allison plot. So again, those of you familiar with your broad landforms within Minnesota know that these sites out here are largely glacial outwash plains. As we get into the Canadian Shield, some of the sites in the northeastern part of the state certainly dealing with well-drained soil, but on fairly shallow substrates. So in terms of these plots, I'm going to go through kind of the history of these data sets, which, I really enjoy history of these studies, and so I apologize if I put you to sleep in the afternoon talking about them. But as Jack and I were talking a little bit about before the webinar, I think most people on this webinar appreciate just the value of these long-term data sets, the importance of documentation. But really, it's now when we're trying to look back at 100-year records that it's so critical that we have these amazing resources to draw upon and look at during a time where we really need some insight as to how our forests are changing going forward. And so the Allison plot is really a unique study and data set. This is an old growth stand established in Itasca State Park. Again, those of you that are familiar with the fire history of Itasca know 1303 was a very important fire year within that landscape. And basically, this even-age red pine stand established following that fire. And J.H. Allison, which is a name that some that have spent time at the University of Minnesota might be familiar with. Later in his career, his nickname was Pop Allison. And in 1923, he established a 2-hectare plot within this old growth area and essentially tagged and mapped all the trees. And this picture in the middle, picture of one of the original tree tags that Allison used, and then a newer tag that we put on just to make sure that we maintain that record. And even though this black and white photo in the lower left-hand corner is pretty useless in terms of getting a glimpse as to what any of these people look like, the reason I pulled this in here is that this red arrow here actually points to, this is Allison, and this arrow here points to Aldo Leopold. And this photo is from 1910 from the Apache National Forest, and basically Allison's reputation at that time was really one of the leaders of timber inventory and cruising for the National Forest, and Leopold actually was his supervisor as part of some of these expeditions. And so it's no surprise that when Allison got to St. Paul and was probably getting a little tired of sitting at his desk, he decided to go up to Itasca State Park and put in this really labor-intensive 2-hectare plot and start some pretty exhaustive measurements for that early time period. And so quite a legacy just in this one area. We were fortunate enough to find this old map, actually Becky Marty from the Minnesota DNR, and this is a hand-drawn map of that plot from 1948. Again, this unit's 5 acres, and really this plot had been largely undiscovered for the past 20 years. And Becky Marty, the DNR, was out there snowshoeing one day and heard this rattling noise on the trees in the distance and realized it was tree tags, and we kind of stumbled across what now has been an amazing resource to look at long-term pine development. And so the hand-drawn map was digitized. We now have kind of digital records of what this plot looked like. It was measured every 5 years from 1923 to 1963, measured again in the 80s, and then also in 2010. And so quite a long-term and detailed record of how this natural stand developed. And this picture in the lower portion here, these are just all the old tree tags. We used a metal detector to locate trees that were no longer present but that were mapped, and so it gave us an idea of where they were. And so we were able to find all the old nails in old tags, and you can kind of see the evolution of even the nails that they used over time, allowing us a really fine-scale look at how this forest developed. Another really amazing long-term study that, again, I know some folks on the webinar are familiar with is the red pine growing stock level study, which was established in 1949 on the Chippewa National Forest within the Cut-Foot Experimental Forest. Again, this is a stand that originated following a natural fire in 1864. Very similar soils to what the Allison plot exists upon. And basically in 1949, they established 5 different levels of growing stock, ranging from 60 to 140 square feet of basal area, and have really maintained that by applying thinning treatments every 5 to 10 years, really from the late 40s all the way to the present. And what's unique about this study is the age of the trees. When they first initiated thinning, were 85 years old, and those of you familiar with the Buckman's red pine burning study, this exact same stands in terms of origin as that study. And at the last measurement period, these were 143 years old, and so quite a long time frame for managed red pine. Those of you not as familiar with red pine management in the lake states, traditionally the rotation age for red pine, depending on the ownership, and this is always moving, but basically it's anywhere from 80 to 120 years, and so we view this as an example of extended rotation forest management in that we are managing that forest beyond what might be recommended by optimum biological rotation age or by optimal economic rotation. So a good glimpse as to how red pine might grow much longer rotation period. And here's a photo of what that looks like at age 143. The upper left-hand corner is just giving you a sense for that lowest stalking level. You can still see that there's some dominant red pine, but certainly the composition's changed quite a bit. I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. And the lower right-hand corner is just what the highest stalking level, 140 square feet, looks like, and certainly quite a bit of red pine making up that stand. Moving along to kind of another series of, I guess they're considered middle-age stands compared to some of the stuff we're working with in the study. We're using a portion of the red pine chronosequence study, basically those that are comparable in age to the red pine growing stock level experiment, to give us a comparison of a managed stand that's originated from the mid-1800s compared to stands that weren't managed that also had a similar date of origin. These, again, are within largely the cut-foot experimental forest. There's no history of active management in these areas, and so really provide a useful comparison for what do we gain by thinning and forests on an extended rotation relative to just allowing forests to get old without any intervention. And again, the age of these stands range from 137 to 105 years. Just a photo of what those look like. Clearly, seasonal differences between these two pictures, but not as much development of the understory or tree size relative to the growing stock level study, and I'll mention a bit more later. And then finally, again, a study that I know several folks on the webinar are already familiar with, work by Sean Fravor and Brian Palick, looking primarily at old-growth forests. Weren't plots that were measured over time, but instead they reconstructed the history of these plots with very detailed dendrochronological analyses. And basically, these represent kind of a useful endpoint of development for us to look at and see, what's the range of conditions that might characterize old-growth stands. And so the age of the oldest living trees in these sites, again, they're not all even age, so we're not going to assign stand age to each of these, but range from 201 to 317 years. And the bottom image, the file, just the bottom figure here, just gives you a picture of what the age structure is like based on increment cores of 4 of these sites, just to give you a flavor for the variety. And this is from the Journal of Vegetation Science paper that Fravor and Palick wrote in 2012. So we have some sites within Itasca State Park that we'd largely consider a single cohort or even age stand, but other sites like Voyagers Island and Sag Lake and the Boundary Waters, where we have certainly multiple cohorts, or at least 2 pronounced cohorts with some intermingling recruitment. And so quite a range of disturbance histories reflecting both surface fires, wind, as well as other disturbance processes, giving us a useful endpoint to look at relative to managed stands and younger unmanaged. So this is just a photo of those sites. Again, a bit of variety, but Loch LaCroix, again, many of you have already visited these places. If you haven't, just amazing places to spend some time at and get a sense for how these forests have developed over time. And Voyagers Island in the lower right-hand side was the oldest maximum red pine age that was found in that. So one of the first things that we were interested in, and again, if we think about trying to inform the best strategies for managing for structure within a system, it's often useful to get a sense for what were the historic patterns of mortality on those sites, and are there spatial patterns as well as temporal patterns in mortality that might be useful to emulate or at least integrate into our management regime, such that we can better create habitat conditions as well as potentially emulate post-fire conditions that may have occurred on these sites. So the first couple of figures I'm going to show in terms of results are largely going to be from that Allison plot within Itasca State Park, because we had stem maps going back all the way to 1923. So we can actually look at what has been the spatial pattern of mortality over time within these areas, and how does that compare to managed stands. So the first figures I have here really are just showing you the overall mortality rates. So on the left-hand side, these both correspond to that Allison plot, so that 207-year-old stand. These figures on the right-hand side correspond to the growing stock level study. And if we look early on, so this is just the age of that stand, when it was being intensively measured by Allison. Steve Spur had some work out there as well, Henry Hansen, Buckman, many others, all of us associate with historic red pine management. During that period, early on, fairly low mortality rate, pretty consistent, 0.5% per year with what we tend to assume as a natural background mortality rate for a lot of our forest types. But if we look at the last measurement period, which is when we were out there, we've seen kind of an increase in mortality rate. This is happening for a couple of reasons. One, there hasn't been a lot of measurements for a long period of time, so we could be pounding a lot of that fine-scale mortality into a single measurement, so it could be an overestimate. But also what we've been seeing on these sites is a greater occurrence of things like armillaria, and so we're starting to see some mortality from that. There's also been some prescribed fire occurring on the site in the late 90s, early 2000s that may be exacerbating some issues out there as well in terms of root disease as well as beetles. But in general, still a fairly low rate. If you compare that with a managed stand, so this is the growing stock level study. These managed sites, this is the average of all the replicates at each period they measured. You notice very low rates of mortality. That's the point. When we thin, we're trying to capture mortality, and so it's no surprise that there's not a lot of mortality occurring in those stands relative to a natural stand. The highest rates of mortality were really observed after the first thinning, again reflecting possibly just thinning shock as well as some initial damage from the first thinnings out in those sites and progressive residual tree firmness and vigor over time. The size of the trees being impacted is what you would expect in terms of mortality. So this is just showing the size of trees and their annual mortality rate at old growth plot. It's just diameter. And again, most of the mortality is happening in the smaller trees, which is reflecting that self-thinning mortality. So again, just like if we were thinking about a developing even age stand, 50 years old, same processes are occurring when it's 200 years old. At this point, mostly small trees are dying. The same can be said, although again, it's such a low rate within the managed. What's really fun about these, although probably dizzying for you in the afternoon after lunch, is to actually look at the pattern of mortality on these sites. And so basically, what I have are two different maps. This map here, each dot, this is from the Allison plot, represents the location of an individual tree in 1923. The triangles are red pine. The squares are jack pine. These circles represent white pine. And so you can see, although we classify this largely as a red pine stand, there were still pockets of jack pine even at age 120 that are either just died or were still alive at that time period. We also have these fingers of white pine throughout that site. What we also notice in the records about the Allison plot is that many of these pockets that are open within the stand, these gaps, were largely occupied by jack pine. And so at age 120, this forest was already shifting from what probably would have been classified as a mixed jack pine or mixed red pine jack pine forest towards greater red pine dominance. And so there's already that spatial pattern out there on the site. If we look at where dead trees were 2010 as well as historically, if we just follow the fate of this area of jack pine, you notice that all those trees had died effectively by 2010. There's also some clumps of jack pine that died in the center of the stand as well as red pine throughout the stand. And so if we look at the actual spatial pattern of mortality, and this is a pattern we've seen in other old growth red pine stands throughout Minnesota, when we look just at red pine, this is just a measure of the degree of aggregation of red pine mortality. What this represents is that in general, no matter what spatial scale we're at, we're seeing random locations of mortality for red pine. It's essentially a random kind of background rate of mortality. But when we look at all the species combined, this line above basically indicates that we have clustering at this scale. And so at the scale ranging from 15 to 30 feet, we see very clumpiness to the mortality, which is reflecting the death of patches of patchy fire and root disease. But when we look at red pine alone, it seems to have more of a random distribution across the site. So what does this result in? This is what the forest looks like in 2007, both pictorially. Here's a picture of the Allison plot at age 207. Excuse me. A lot of red pine, individual white spruce scattered here and there, and a lot of hazel. But we look at what's happened where we know we had large gaps historically. This area in the upper left-hand corner, the red represents red maple. We have ironwood. So any ingrowth that we're seeing going forward really is composed of hardwood species. We're seeing very little recruitment, if any, of conifers. And the existing structure on this site, you notice, is pretty patchy. We have these large open areas. And again, these are historic places where jack pine likely occupied a large portion of the stand. And so we have these gaps that have been maintained over time. And so, again, this is consistent with a lot of what we've been seeing with other red pine forests in Minnesota, that the mortality patterns for red pine tend to be fairly random. And if we think about what we might expect for spatial patterns. Often if we think that root disease or surface fire are important, then we would expect mortality actually to be very clumpy in the stand, basically groups of trees dying. But we're not seeing that, at least for red pine. Basically, where we are seeing groups of trees dying, it's non-red pine, so clumpiness and things like jack pine. And again, this is a picture of armillaria in the lower left-hand corner, fruiting within the Allison plot, and this is a gap forming within the Allison plot due to armillaria. And so we are starting to see some of these gaps opening up. But unfortunately, what largely occupies these gaps is hazel with very little recruitment of other species. We had the 2012 windstorm, which really impacted a lot of this red pine. So we're starting to see some gap development within these stands, but largely being occupied by a few scattered hardwoods and some, a lot of hazel. And I'll talk a bit more about what might be going on. So that gives an idea, at least, about kind of the spatial patterns of mortality at a fine scale within this large plot. But one of the things that we're often interested in is trying to manage for kind of late successional structure within these pine forests. And so we have a sense for what the mortality rates might have been, but now we often want to get an idea for how far off are some of our managed forests from some benchmarks associated with, old growth stands. And so I'm going to present a couple of slides that at least give a sense for kind of the range and structural conditions that exist across these data sets, just to give you a picture as to kind of what the level of variability is. And I know some of the folks on the webinar are very familiar with this level of variability from other places in Michigan and elsewhere, but looking at kind of how these managed stands and old growth stands fall out in relation to their structure. And so one of the biggest attributes, and it's no surprise that differs quite a bit between these forests, is the amount of downwoody debris. I know we're dealing with the Joint Fire Sciences group, and so yes, we could think of these as fuels, but most of this is really dealing with our pieces of wood that are 10,000-hour fuels above in terms of their size. And so these are really large pieces of down wood that are important for habitat as well as for carbon storage on the site. So if we look at kind of the old growth stands, you notice N equals 8, so there's 7 plots from the Fravor and Palak study as well as the Allison plot. These are the chronosequence sites, and this is the extended rotation red pine growing stock level study. If we look at this down coarse woody debris volume alone, it's almost 7-fold greater than the second growth sites within the old growth stands, and certainly within the extended rotation, 15-fold greater than that. So it makes perfect sense. Obviously, there's no extraction happening within these stands, and so a large tree dies, a large tree stays in the ground. The second growth sites, even though these aren't being managed, most of what's dying are smaller trees, and so we have very small inputs to that deadwood pool. So there's some pretty pronounced differences between what we see between the old growth, second growth, and extended rotation. In terms of snags, same deal. You have big trees in these old growth stands, and so when the trees die, we have a large snag basal area within the old growth relative to second growth and extended rotation. Whereas with snag density, there's actually not a difference in snag density between the old growth stands and unmanaged second growth stands. But if you look at the difference between these two in terms of basal area, what this is reflecting is that, yes, there's a lot of snags within these unmanaged stands, but they tend to be very small. If you remember, we have a lot of self-thinning mortality happening in these forests. So even though we have a lot of snags being created, they're not very large. Whereas those snags that are being created within these old growth sites tend to be large trees, and certainly from a habitat standpoint, quite important and quite functional. So if we were to look at kind of the range of structural conditions across these sites, this is just the ordination diagram looking at all of the structural attributes found within extended rotation, unmanaged second growth, so the chronosequence sites, the old growth sites, and kind of arraying those in a gradient representing kind of a range in structural conditions. These are just symbol coded, so again, extended rotation are the triangles, second growth are the squares, and old growth are the circles. There's pretty pronounced separation between the old growth sites and the extended rotation sites, and a lot of that really reflects the higher downwoody debris volume. So these sites down here have a lot more dead wood in them, whereas what's interesting is if these managed stands actually tend to have the highest level of red pine dominance. Those of you that work in red pine management know typically, especially in these stands that initiate naturally and have a heavy mix component to them, the goal over time is to remove those lower value, certainly as well as higher risk trees early on. And so these extended rotation stands are becoming more pure over time due to the selective removal of things like jack pine, white spruce, balsam fir to increase that red pine component. And really the only overlap that exists is a little bit of overlap between the old growth and the unmanaged stands. That corresponds to a fairly high snag density within some of these unmanaged second growth sites. So it's clear, certainly from a dead wood standpoint, and it's no surprise, we're removing wood from these extended rotation stands, that they're going to have a lower amount of down-weighted debris on the site. But we were really interested in trying to understand, even though we recognize that things like dead wood might be lower, are there ways in which extended rotation management, so managing red pine on rotations beyond the biological optimum age, could still accelerate some of those structural conditions that we find within second growth stands. And so the nice thing is having both the Allison plot, where we measured at a very fine scale over time, and the red pine growing stock level study, where we've measured at a fine scale over time, we can actually look step by step, which forest is growing, reaching these structural attributes faster. So what this is basically 3 diameter distributions. So this is density over size for the Allison plot, highest stocking level, so 140 square feet per acre from the growing stock level study, and then the chronosequence. And so for the Allison plot and the growing stock level study, we have different stand ages. Those truly are different measurement periods. For the chronosequence, these stand ages just represent different stands of different origin periods, so kind of a space for time substitution. And so the dark band line for all of these represents what these stands look like at the first measurement. So at age 120 in the Allison plot, we have a very skewed unimodal curve. Likewise, within the 140 square foot per acre stocking level, we have the same curve form. The same corresponds to this 137-year-old unmanaged stand. If we follow how these curves evolve through time, though, and the shape of that distribution, by the last measurement period in 2007, within the Allison plot, this has really shifted dramatically. We have most of the stockings in these larger size classes, and we've really kind of shifted this curve to skew towards the right in terms of tree size. What's interesting, and this is a 207-year-old stand, if we look at the growing stock level study, which is a managed stand, we have a very similar shift, if not actually a greater shift, towards high density of large trees, but in a much shorter period of time. So by age 143, this stand is approximating that diameter distribution that was found in this unmanaged stand at age 207. And within the old unmanaged second growth stands, we see these are still not shifting the distribution towards large trees. There's still quite a bit of density within those intermediate classes, so kind of showing how that diameter distribution has shifted. Again, what's really fun, maybe for me, maybe torture for you, in terms of these long-term studies, is that we can look at very fine-scale changes in structure over time and see, not that we're racing, what gets there faster, an old-growth stand or a managed stand, but at least get an idea for, is there the potential to accelerate some of this old forest structure through active management on these sites. And so what this is, again, is another ordination diagram, but what we're looking at now are all the different time periods at the Allison plot, so that's in our filled circle, and then 3 of the stocking levels for the extended rotation plots. So these are 140 square feet per acre, 120 square feet per acre, 100 square feet per acre, and so basically looking at those different stocking levels. And what we see is that certainly the Allison plot over time is developing, and what this axis really corresponds to is, as this develops, we're getting greater size inequality. We're also getting more red pine dominance because the jack pine is dying out from those stands. But you notice that these other sites, so these managed stands, are keeping pace with that, and by age 143, which is the last measurement period, they already are very close to what we're seeing in those old growth stands. Very similar shift. What's also interesting is this lowest density stand, 80 square feet, stand, they hadn't treated it for a few years. When they treat that stand, it quickly shifts towards what was more comparable to the other managed sites. And so they've gone in and they've actually removed quite a bit of the growth that had occurred with balsam fir on those, so shifting it. And so based on just the live tree structure, we really think that and demonstrate that we can accelerate some of the development of these structures that we care about in our red pine, older red pine. One final point along those lines, again, just comparing the 2 studies. Trying to operate here. If we look at the left-hand panel, this is just the Allison plot at age 120, and then what the diameter distribution looked like at age 149. This is a good time to look at where that jack pine really dropped out. So these hashed bars are jack pine. You notice by 149, there's only a few remaining. And what's really happened is that we're just seeing a shift of this largely normal distribution during that time period. If we look at the extended rotation stands, and this is just picking on the 100 square foot per acre stocking level, at age 120 years, a fairly simple diameter distribution. But after 143 years, we now have a greater shift towards larger diameter trees than what was seen in that old growth plot. And we're also getting quite a bit of ingrowth of both white pine, a little bit of red pine, and balsam fir. And one of the things interesting about this condition is that Eric Zenner did some great work looking at forest structural conditions across Itasca State Park. And this is one of the diameter distributions that he has for a 300-year-old red pine stand. And you notice that this managed stand actually is starting to approximate some of the very similar characteristics in terms of live tree structure that he was finding within this very old stand. So again, giving you a sense for kind of how we can accelerate some of that development. Also, I recognize that this isn't always a desirable condition within the context of fire, but nonetheless, certainly giving you a sense for just how quickly we can accelerate towards some of these conditions with active management. So what's going to happen in the future in some of these sites? Red pine is a tricky one in Minnesota, certainly throughout the lake states, and that, again, we were really blessed with a large area of red pine, following, large-scale fires, particularly, again, in north-central Minnesota in the mid-1800s and even into the early 1900s, where we had a lot of seed origin, large-scale regeneration of red pine in the landscape. And now we're at a stage where we certainly can keep thinning these forests and develop structural conditions that are desirable from a habitat standpoint. But we often are struck, at least I am, and I know many others, when we walk into the understory of these stands as to what is going to come back in these forests as we start losing that red pine, both the disturbance, certainly disease on these sites. And so just to give you kind of a glimpse as to what's happening at that Allison plot, again, our 207-year-old natural stand. 1948, they did a survey of the saplings on that site. And what we saw, and which I think many of you would expect just knowing red pine systems, a lot of the understory was composed in terms of saplings of balsam fir, white spruce, a little bit of birch, and certainly a few scattered red pine. They did a series of prescribed fires, late 90s, early 2000s, both to reduce some of the ladder fuels that were developing on that site, but also hoping to create favorable seedbed conditions for red pine as well as white pine on that site. And what we really have been left with following that, and I'm not going to blame the fire for it, it's really a couple other factors I'll discuss in a second driving that. Right now, the saplings out there, and you can see a picture, this is the Allison plot again, like a longleaf pine stand in terms of visibility. We do have a few scattered red maple, things like bur oak. Mind you, we're on the prairie forest border here, ironwood. And we've been seeing this pattern as well in some of the jack pine woodland communities in this portion of Minnesota, that we're seeing a strong shift towards hardwood dominance in the understory in systems that historically were largely pine and conifer-dominated stands. And what's going on, particularly within these systems, is there's just tremendous deer pressure on these sites. So any conifer regeneration that is occurring, particularly any red pine, white pine, or jack pine regeneration occurring, is being browsed. And what's also happening is, certainly in the case of red pine, we have serious diplodia issues. Jana Albers has done some great work demonstrating just the amount of diplodia spores that are in this portion of the landscape. And so we're stuck with a situation where the long-term trajectory of these red pine stands is really towards kind of a brushy hardwood type site. Again, here's the Allison plot in the upper left-hand corner. 3 burns, 1 in the 9, all spring burns, late 90s, early 2000s. This picture on the right is the Inger area. It's a joint burn project with the Forest Service and DNR, just to the north of the Chippewa National Forest. Same burn year, same sequence, yet this site has a tremendous amount of white pine coming back amongst the hazel. And the biggest difference between these two sites is essentially deer density, and so potentially what we're seeing here is just the deer are selectively removing any regeneration we're getting in the Allison plot. The lower left-hand corner, this is on the Cloquet Forestry Center. No fire in this case, it's just a mechanical mulching, so using a mastication equipment to scarify the site, and we also have very good red pine regeneration in these areas. And so within the Allison plot, they're really struggling right now to think about the long-term potential for red pine in the site. And as these gaps continue to develop, we're concerned about what may be the future. Finally, this is from the growing stock level study. This is the lowest stocking level treatment. Again, these are red pine. but you notice the abundance of other species regenerating, and what that's reflective of is that they harvest these sites typically late summer, early fall, so you're getting a lot of incidental scarification, and again, getting quite a bit of regeneration where we have lower deer density. So in terms of the background patterns, and I know other work, certainly in Michigan, it's also found these patterns as well, and they're now starting to talk a bit more about this in the development of Pacific Northwest systems. That we often think about mortality has to be these clumps of trees dying, but typically when we look at red pine region, patterns of mortality for red pine tend to be largely random when we get into these mature stands, kind of this background rates of mortality, and then we might get these clumps of trees dying due to armillaria, but oftentimes those are associated with where jack pine used to be in the forest or other types of dynamics. Many of these forests, and the same goes for the Cloquet Forestry Center or other extensive areas of red pine that we have in the state. If we were there 60 years ago, we would have thought of those forests as jack pine, red pine forests. And so a lot of what we're working with in terms of this mature red pine type really has a legacy of jack pine within it that was quite important. And the structure that we see out there now in terms of spatial arrangement of trees reflects where that jack pine was currently mixed within those stands. The rates of mortality are certainly higher in these forests, and oftentimes we view mortality as a bad thing, and it certainly is if you're growing cabin logs and that is your primary objective. But in many cases, the mortality rates that we've seen over time in these old-growth stands are what's generating that important structure in terms of wood. So trying to find ways to integrate that into our management if our goal is to kind of increase the amount of large wood, and I'm not talking about fine wood, but certainly large wood that could serve as habitat, and so you certainly have a lower risk of kind of immediate combustion on the sites. And one of the, I think, more important thing that we found from this work is that, there's been a lot of debate about should we be managing our forests on extended rotations, and what we found, particularly with red pine, which is a species that everybody in the webinar knows can live to be, well over 300 years, certainly responds well to management well beyond age 100, that within these forests, when we compare the development of a natural old-growth red pine stand to one that's actually been actively thinned, we can literally truncate 60 years off of the development of that stand by kind of actively thinning and progressively increasing tree size as well as tree complexity, diversity on that site. And oftentimes a lot of the challenges folks complain, well, what does that mean in terms of productivity? But we've also looked at productivity within these extended rotation stands. So again, looking at these forests beyond traditional rotation age. And what we found, this is just a graph from a paper we had in the Canadian Journal in 2010. If we look at periodic annual increment, which is the solid line here, and mean annual increment, which is the dashed line here, that through these repeated thinning treatments over time, we actually are prolonging when that culminates, and basically, still getting productivity gains as has been seen other places like in Europe as well as in the Pacific Northwest with repeated thinning. It's also important is if you look at the shape of the mean annual increment curve, this is not plateauing and then dropping off. And basically, it's a fairly flat curve, so there's a lot of opportunities for when we might choose a rotation age with red pine, depending on what the goals are for habitat restoration, and certainly still getting some response from thinning. The last thing is, these studies, certainly the thinning study, the goal was to treat it like we treated things in the 1950s, and so the thinning was, largely a low thinning, uniformly applied across the stand. But when we look at basically what's happening with the mortality patterns in these stands, certainly many on this webinar are experts and familiar with kind of the mixed severity fire regimes that historically affected these landscapes. By managing just kind of with thinning and not thinking much about spatial pattern, we really are failing to acknowledge what the historic patterns may have been in terms of tree density as well as tree size and spatial structure on these sites. And so what we've been thinking a lot more about is certainly growing these trees on a longer rotation, but when we're thinning them or manipulating these stands, thinking about it more within the context of variable density harvest regimes, which again I know many folks are familiar with. But basically, this is just an aerial photo of some trials in the Chippewa National Forest that Brian Palick has been leading, looking at different spatial arrangements of red pine within variable density thinning regimes, and trying to emulate the patchiness that we would see following fire as well as other disturbance regimes. And I'd be remiss, a lot of what I've been talking about today has been looking backwards and trying to understand how these forests have developed. But there's been some great work coming out of the West talking about how these variable density thinning regimes and these spatial patterns also have important implications as we think about kind of the adaptation potential of a forest in terms of increasing the heterogeneity that's out there in terms of tree spatial arrangement. So if we were to look at the, kind of break down the anatomy of this area here, instead of having kind of a uniform kind of spatial arrangement, there's a lot of differences in terms of what we might see in regards to vulnerability, resilience, resistance to disturbance. And so in these single tree areas, and I'm almost done, so I'll answer those questions that are being typed. In the single tree area, basically, from a habitat standpoint, we have kind of more of a distributed habitat. If we're looking for mature habitat across the harvested area, we've had some recent work in red pine that have shown, when we thin these red pine to low densities, we have kind of higher resilience to drought, and so these might be areas where we have lower drought sensitivity. Certainly easier areas to run burns and reintroduce fire to a system, and so lower fire vulnerability. But the flip side is certainly having greater vulnerability to wind. On the other end of the spectrum are clumps, and historically we thought of these as refugia for for animals that needed kind of interior habitat, but certainly could also be refugia as we start getting climatic extremes for plants and animals that need more interior habitat. Certainly they're more vulnerable to drought because we have a higher density, but lower vulnerability to wind, higher vulnerability to fire. One thinking also is these higher density areas can be important for thinking about places that have greater selection pressure and the potential for adaptation on site for phenotypes and other adapted species. And then finally, what I've talked a lot about and the big issue is that we're not getting a lot of regeneration in these pine forests over time. And as we think about kind of going forward with these forests, we want to provide opportunities for other species to get established that might be locally present and predicted to be adapted in the future, or might not actually be present now on the stand, but might be projected to do better in those sites under future climate scenarios. And so these open areas within these variable density thinning and retention regimes would be places to both increase regen as well as increase the adaptation and transition potential on that site. So with that, I just want to acknowledge the many people, particularly people like John Allison, Henry Hansen, Bob Buckman, John Benzie, Zig Zazada, Paul Zengraf, other folks, Crystal Curran, that have maintained these plots over time. This is a picture of Allison, or Pop Allison. Again, those of you that have spent time on the St. Paul Metro, there is an Allison forest that basically surrounds the Vadnais Heights, the Lake Vadnais, which is a water supply for St. Paul, and Allison planted hundreds of acres of red pine off-site on that ownership, and this is him receiving an award from the mayor of St. Paul for that work, and so an amazing individual. Many of these other individuals listed here have left an amazing legacy that allows us to look at kind of these long-term studies and draw important insights for them. With that, I think I will navigate through the questions that are on the side. Jack, if that seems all right.
Oh, yes, yeah, go ahead. Great webinar, Tony, and you got a bunch of questions answered.
Okay. So and Gary Birch, in terms of the first question, what we're seeing, at least in these systems, it's a seasonal thing. Yeah, there's certainly some browse on aspen and birch, but within these sites, actually this time of year, although we got good snow cover right now, but typically in the fall and then going into the spring, we get a lot of conifer browse, preferential browsing. There's no longer much for palatable browse in the deciduous species. So, used to be just white pine, then it became just white pine, red pine. Now basically all three pines in Minnesota, white pine, red pine, jack pine are all heavily hit by deer, and so we do see some browsing on birch and aspen, but there's so much of it, particularly the aspen out there, that it's not an issue in terms of it affecting generation success of the species. There's plenty of that coming back on those sites. And the paper birch is a neat one. I mean, you always see it in these older red pine stands kind of as a minor component. Even in this picture I have here, you can see a birch in the background there. So you always see it's always a minor component of these sites, kind of seeds into areas, and you'll get it in actually fairly small, not small, but half-acre openings, fine browse standpoint in this landscape. In terms of leaving coarse weight debris in the ground during thinning, the challenge, as always, is actually one of the pictures I had in here. You can see that there's been some deliberate felling and leaving of larger diameter trees. Of course, the challenge is, again, if you're sensitive to worrying a bit about fire risk, trying to minimize the amount of fines that are out there. But in terms of habitat, things like pine marten, we also, we overlook it, but there's certainly a lot of saprozoic or deadwood dependent beetles, as well as fungi that then are important parts of the broader food chain. And so from a habitat standpoint, thinking about it, even, certainly depending on the size of the log, bears and other things will use it, but small mammals also quite readily use that. So certainly an important part of habitat out there for different organisms. And so during a thinning operation, one option would be, what might have been lower value species or lower value individuals that, your best option for that is lucky pulp, possibly leaving some of those trees, or leaving a certain proportion of that wood out there on the site if possible. I recognize that, people need to make money off your woods too, so there's a trade-off there in terms of dead wood is left behind. In terms of the wind and fire interaction, that's a great question, Jack. And, we always talked about, Heinzelman was able to find fire scars and able to, age a few trees and say that's this forest developed following a fire. But certainly windstorms and small gaps don't leave behind scars that 300 years later we can say, oh, there was a windstorm here as well. And so a lot of Sean Fraber's work in particular, and I think others since have shown that we often underestimate just the importance of wind in some of these systems and driving dynamics, and as well as certainly changing the structure of that forest. And so we would see some interactions between fire directly, where you might have higher fuel loading in an area following a historic fire, so it might burn hotter in a place, and so you'd get more exposed mineral soil and more recruitment of pine in those places. But also, I think fire could act singly and just create gaps that might accelerate development of shade tolerance or kind of brushy areas on these sites. So I think wind's quite important in these forests, and historically, certainly the Dryden fire and then what we've seen in the BWCA as well, they can also interact quite dramatically for major shifts out there. Ian's question, I'll be a millionaire if I can answer that one. In terms of managing against hazel and hardwoods in the gap, the main work that's been ongoing looking at this is the red pine retention study that Brian Palak's been leading since the early 2000s, where they've created large gaps, but they've, I don't want to guess at it, but the competition control budget on that, they've been doing, it's all brush saw work, has been over, I think we're talking 6 digits in terms of the cost to free those seedlings. And so, some of what is being discussed now is do we try to get into these areas before that hazel's developed? And so historically, maybe we'd thin, and then finally think about regeneration. And so by age 90 or 120, we've been thinning, and as a result, that hazel layer is really developed. But in some cases, during those initial thinning entries, either, whether it be in or second thinning entries where you still have a fairly dense canopy, so there's not as much understory present, you will get some incidental red pine regeneration on site, just because that forest has been so shady, there's not that competition. We've had some success. Again, there's a study we did at the Cloquet Forestry Center. It was a study that was established by Dan Gilmore, and then I ended up publishing the results in the Northern Journal, where we tried a couple of different methods, and the most success we had was kind of a combination of herbicides and mechanical mulching, so it was just a brush crusher type technique, and we actually had quite good success with the natural regeneration of red pine. We also did just mechanical alone, herbicides alone, and prescribed burning alone. It really seemed to be the combination of herbicide with mechanical treatment was able to do that. So if you have the option to go that intensive, that seems to work quite well. If not, I think that the key is, can we possibly conditioning the site with a series of burns, getting it to the point where, that hazel layer has been knocked back enough that when you do create a gap, you have a chance to eat with the hazel. In terms of Giorgio's, I wish the grazers would get the hazel first. They do browse the hazel, but within those stands, it really tends to be quite a, it's just so abundant and vigorous across the site that they really, especially when the leaves are gone, they're really going out there. Question from Mike North in terms of what entities are implementing extent. Yeah, and I think this is an excellent question because there's really a disconnect between what extension rotation management is relative to possibly how it was interpreted when that policy was dropped by the DNR. So to those of you not familiar with it, there's no longer kind of a formal policy that they'll be doing rotation forestry on Minnesota DNR lands. And the argument that was made was that because the industry is down so much, that we're already going to have old forests happening everywhere. So why should we deliberately manage for it? And really, what I'm arguing for, in the study, you notice that the unmanaged second growth stands, I do not call those extended rotation, because basically, if we just allow forest, if we plant a dense stand, allow it to age without any thinning, we know that those trees really aren't going to be able to withstand kind of a long-term history of wind and other things that affect stands that are grown at a high density. And if we're doing extended rotation management in red pine, and this is why it's a perfect species for it, we are thinning that stand over time and over a long time period. And by doing that, we're actually creating trees that structurally can withstand being out there for 150 and 200 years. And I think when that policy was dropped, I think it was just assumed that this is an old forest is extended rotation forest. From a silviculture standpoint, we really think of it as this is a program of thinning treatments that's going to allow that forest to grow longer than normal rotation. In terms of folks that are doing it, St. Louis County Land Department long time ago recognized what Buckman and then Bryan, and then we were finding from those red pine studies, and so they do have stands that they're managing on extended rotations. Just to give one example, within Minnesota, they have some really nice, well beyond 100 years, 120 years on their land. Certainly in Minnesota, that's one example, as well as national forests within the state. Can prescribed fire be used to control armillaria and red pine? I think the challenge with armillaria is that it can be, as again many of you it's both a saprophyte and a saprotroph and a biotroph, right? So it can sit and persist on dead wood for a long period of time, and then once those trees get weakened, it can actually attack living wood. And so even if you were to burn an area, you're going to have dead stumps, dead material in the soil where that armillaria can exist. And I really haven't seen much evidence that armillaria burning removes armillaria unless you get such a hot fire it burns out all the stump and gets rid of all the subsurface dead wood. Is really a challenging. The disease of the site. It's hard to get rid of that disease of the site, and most folks would argue, if you pretty extreme measures, pulling stumps, get rid of it from an area. What tends to happen is those areas will then cycle through, a period of oak or other species that maybe aren't as affected by armillaria on the site. But it's not there is some thinking with diplodia and some of those shoot blights that prescribed fire and kind of increasing airflow might reduce diplodia risk. But for armillaria, it's a tough one. And to be honest, it's a natural part of these forests. You look at kind of even old documents, old records, it's always been out there creating background mortality. And the challenge is that we know it gets more virulent during drought periods, and so if we do start having more drought, we might have more incidents of armillaria causing mortality. It's great for creating heterogeneity out there, but yeah, it's a challenge to deal with if you're trying to maintain trees in a healthy status I haven't seen much, but I could be missing something in terms of fire helping out with it. In terms of the herbicides that were more effective, what was used for that study was hexazinone, so granular herbicide, which I recognize now is not allowed on FSC certified lands. So it was a pretty potent mix. There has been some work that working with glyphosate and others, it's not as effective as fire. But this was a single application of prescribed fire, so it was one burn compared to a single application of herbicides, and so as everybody in this webinar knows, that single application of fire only angered the hazel back doubly thick following the burn. The examples that I was showing towards the end there, where we had multiple fires applied, really was effective at reducing that, getting good regeneration of the site. But this was just a single burn relative to application of herbicide.
need to take a breath, Tony?
I know, huh? Keep catching
Great,
up on my
great.
reading, you know.
Yeah, great webinar. Wonderful questions. If anybody still has a last-minute question, go ahead and type it in the chat box. Mike North asked the question. He said, will the presentation be available online for viewing? Yes, this is being recorded. I'll be getting the recording link up on our website hopefully this afternoon. So you'll be able to share that with others, either to look back yourself or to share it with others who may have missed this talk.
And by all means, feel free to follow up with me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions, folks.
Yes, yes. And Tony's information, contact information, is also on a specific web page that highlights this webinar. Any other thoughts, Tony? Or
no, I really appreciate everybody logging in. And, you know, again, I think we're really spoiled to have a lot of this red pine out there in the landscape, but that's important to think going forward, how are we going to maintain here and hazel and certainly other changes. So I really appreciate the interest and look forward to other folks thinking that.
Great, great. Well, again, I'd like to thank you, Tony, for taking this time with us, and thank everybody on the line also for joining us this afternoon. Again, this is recorded, so you can go to our website and get this link to share with other folks or review it again yourself. Our next webinar is going to be December 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 1 p.m. Central. You can get the webinar link off our website or watch for it in newsletters and other announcements. The December 18th webinar is going to be a two-part webinar, actually. It's going to be two short webinars that feature summaries that are part of the 2014 intern projects that we have funded. So I guess any questions, feel free to email me or look at the webpage for that. I don't see any other questions other than a lot of thanks in the chat box. So at this point, we'll be shutting this down. Again, I want to thank you, Tony, and thank everyone for participating today, and make sure everybody has a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everybody, again, for your attention.